This analysis that was leaked basically said China is outmanoeuvring America. It must be the kind of thing that makes people in the White House, the Trump White House, absolutely livid.
Your first indicator, a bombshell, a genuine bombshell. China is essentially beating America at its own capitalist game. And that is something that Americans freak out over.
For Beijing, Taiwan is its absolute red line. All the signals that we have on Trump on Taiwan up till now is that he's actually quite ambivalent towards Taiwan. And so I think that is leading a lot of hawks in the administration to think he might sell Taiwan out.
Hello and welcome to the Fourcast Indicators with me, Matt Frei.
And me, Mark Urban. On the Fourcast Indicators, we look at the signs that analysts watch out for most closely, the hints that suggest imminent change in global affairs that may just be about to happen.
Later on, we'll be bringing you the latest indicators on the Iran war. But to start with, there's one big story dominating the international stage today, and that's Trump's meeting with China's President Xi Jinping in Beijing. And I'm very happy to say that we're joined by China expert and Times contributing editor Cindy Yu to help us dissect what it all really means. So let's get straight into it. Mark, your first indicator, a bombshell, a genuine bombshell.
My first indicator obviously relates to the visit. And this is the leak to the Washington Post, sort of as President Trump is airborne, of this Pentagon analysis. Now, they call it a dime analysis, which is not what it's worth. It's the acronym in the intelligence world for defense, intelligence, military, and economic. That's the dime. And basically, this analysis that was leaked to the Washington Post and gave them a splash while the president was airborne basically said China is outmaneuvering America on pretty much all of these fronts. From the big successes they've had in insulating themselves from the Gulf energy shock. We've talked about that before because of the big oil stockpile and everything else they had in place, to the successes they're having in military production, and on the information side, to the success they're having in painting the Americans as floundering, warmongering and all the rest of it in terms of information warfare. And so clearly...
With the Americans helping along a little bit with their language, let's be honest.
Well, so clearly they had come to this very unfavorable analysis. I mean, it must be the kind of thing that makes people in the White House, the Trump White House, absolutely livid. I mean, this is the blob, isn't it, biting back? And the intelligence analysts at the Pentagon essentially saying, I think in part because they're smarting about the situation that Trump has got them into in the Gulf. And we'll talk about other leaks in relation to Iran as well. There's a lot of leaking going on at the expense of the administration right now. And in this case, it's bang on the money on the China summit.
Yeah. I mean, I was going to add my indicator, which is, there's this extraordinary pomp and circumstance, and the Chinese are as good at this stuff as the Americans and the Brits can be when we want to be. And so Trump is greeted with, waving flags and incredible music, and he's full of effusive rhetoric about Xi Jinping. And I kind of wonder, why does he love Xi Jinping this much? There's a real bromance going on there, and maybe you can explain, Cindy, why you think that's the case. But within all this, they're going to be talking about all these things, and then of course Taiwan is going to come up, and it did come up. But what was so interesting was that Donald Trump, who never shuts up, given the presence of a microphone, when asked about Taiwan by a phalanx of White House correspondents who traveled with him, basically said nothing. He was standing next to Xi Jinping and he said not a word, and he was asked again and again, and he didn't respond and then just wandered off, right? At the same time, on the official Chinese media, their headline was, Taiwan did come up, and Xi Jinping said that if this isn't, I'm paraphrasing, if this isn't sorted out, it could lead to conflict with America in the worst case scenario. Now, the fact that they spelt this out like that is really interesting, because that's not exactly part of the protocol, because it was like the item on CCTV this morning, Beijing time. And the fact that Trump said nothing makes me think, makes probably you think too, that actually this was a real bone of contention here. And I just wonder to what extent, where was the friction? We don't know. So was it the fact that Trump, with an eye on his own domestic audience, because bashing China is popular with Democrats and Republicans, decided that he wouldn't, scrap the $14 billion weapons package for Taiwan that has been put in the long grass, that he decided maybe not to scrap the $11 billion one, which he didn't sign off on, or that he didn't use the kind of language which Chinese fantasists had been hoping for, that he'd go from we don't support independence to we oppose independence. So there's a point of friction there. Clearly for the Chinese, it's the leverage of whatever he does on Taiwan against what they can do with Iran on the Straits of Hormuz.
And I think it must have taken so much self-restraint for him to stop talking in that interview at that moment. Because before he was just doing his typical
He was gushing.
Trump weave.
He's a gusher.
Exactly. Yeah, this is a great meeting. China's amazing. My friend President Xi asked about Taiwan. Suddenly silence. And I think that would have taken so much self-restraint. I mean, one interpretation could be that was a bone of contention, that he put his foot down. All the signals that we have on Trump on Taiwan up till now is that he's actually quite ambivalent towards Taiwan. You know, famously before the last US election, he said that the US should just behave like an insurance company. There's nothing emotional or out of love that they have for Taiwan, nothing ideologically committing them to Taiwan's defense. Just that if Taiwan pays, we'll defend them. And if they don't pay, then good luck to them. You know, so it's ambivalence that other presidents haven't been so cold-hearted about, at least rhetorically. And so I think that is leading a lot of hawks in the administration to think, gosh, he might sell Taiwan out.
Sorry, I'm going to jump in, Matt. So I saw some people labeling the Xi bit of the readout where he says, we've got to resolve this carefully, otherwise it could be really dangerous, on Taiwan, as kind of boilerplate, the kind of thing he would always say. Or do you take the view that it was more of a warning? Where do you stand on
It's
that?
both, right? I mean, it's the core. China calls it the reddest of its red lines. It is the most core interest for China. You know, for us in the West, we look at Taiwan, we think, God, why does China even care? Like, what is even the problem? We have to switch that mindset and understand that for Beijing, Taiwan is its absolute red line. That if Taiwan were to declare independence, that is the one guaranteed thing to usher on an invasion scenario, because China would say we cannot allow this to happen. So that warning was China telling Trump, don't do anything stupid here. Don't encourage them to declare independence. We know they have de facto independence, but nobody's ever declared it. Because if you do, that is literally the make or break for our relationship and for I guess, peace in the region.
But what I find so fascinating is that, you know, Trump is a guy who famously thinks in terms of hemispheres. You know, I have the Western Hemisphere, you, Xi, have the Eastern Hemisphere. You more or less do what you like where you have to do it. I can't imagine that Trump, who doesn't really believe in global American principles. You know, he never talks about defending democracy in Ukraine. That's not his thing. No. That's not what he's interested in. Why would he suddenly deploy that argument in Taiwan? I can't imagine him doing that. So what else is preventing him, if that is true, from not giving Xi what Xi wants, the change of wording?
There are hard power reasons to defend Taiwan as well as democratic reasons. You know, Taiwan is obviously the world leading producer of semiconductors, exactly. And of course, under Trump's last presidency, he kickstarted the Arizona plant, the kind of distribution capability of that manufacturing chain. But as we've heard, it's actually been quite difficult to do that, to replicate that in America. So that's one. The other thing is just the geopolitical, the control of the region. You know, if China controls Taiwan, then it has what it's called the first island chain sewn up. And so that is then much more of a source of threat to countries like Japan and South Korea and America's presence in the Indo-Pacific as well. So all of that is, if you're a hard-headed hawk, you should care about Taiwan as well.
I think also, Matt, in terms of it's in there in the Trump national security strategy. This idea of the control of the most advanced chips. That if China gets Taiwan, and I guess given the Trump attitude to control of strategic waterways or oil or whatever, that's all part of his sort of geopolitical worldview, isn't it?
But you're right to point out that he doesn't care about democracy so much. In the pre-visit interview he gave about
Jimmy Lai,
exactly.
Oh my goodness, yes.
So what he basically said, and I paraphrase here, he was asked about whether or not he'd raised Jimmy Lai, this jailed former media mogul in Hong Kong. And he said, well, Jimmy Lai's caused bedlam for China. It's like asking me if I would let Comey out after putting him behind bars. James Comey being the former FBI director he's been trying to put behind bars. That kind of language, it comes from China.
I know,
it doesn't come from America, but it did.
But he did raise it.
But he did say he would still raise Jimmy Lai.
Yes, readout. He did raise it.
Yes.
But it's not out of the.
But also remember,
his own
he wasn't
heart,
very nice about Jamal Khashoggi when MBS was in the Oval Office as well. Trump hasn't got a great track record when it comes to defending, human rights victims or prisoners.
Yeah.
You have an indicator for us. What is it, Cindy?
Yes, I've got an indicator because thinking about this visit compared to the last visit that Trump made, and actually any American president made in 2017, China has changed a lot. And my indicator is the use of this anti-foreign sanctions law that China has triggered earlier this month. And now that sounds boring, but stay with me for a second here, because what it means is that when the US sanctions Chinese companies or other companies working with Chinese companies, China is now saying, well, actually, if you're a Chinese company, you have recourse now to take these other companies to court for obeying US sanctions. So if you're a Singaporean bank house, if you are an insurance company in the UK, for example, and you're obeying with American sanctions and not cooperating with Chinese sanctioned entities, China can now take you to court inside China. So this is a massive potential loss of earnings if this power is seen through in the courts, but China's triggered it now anyway. It's basically saying, pick US sanctions or pick doing business with us. It is something that they have never done
Which is kind of what
before.
the Americans have done to the rest of the world for a very long time.
Sure, and it's
secondary sanctions.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
and China's never done this before. It's kind of, especially in 2017, it kind of backed down when there were sanctions against Huawei, against ZTE, another massive chip maker. And so that difference between that last visit and now, and China basically signaling, we're not going to back down this time when you sanction us. I think it's the beginning of a new phase of China.
It's a big power play.
Yeah.
I think, the story of the last year, surely on so many levels, is that America has learned, both on a military level, but also on an economic trading level, the limits of its power and its power to bully. And China has learned the extent of its power, rare earth metals and so on. Which brings me to another little indicator, if I may, which is, we all thought at the beginning, did we not, when the Gulf War started on the 28th of February, that China, with its enormous demand for energy, so much of it comes through the Strait of Hormuz, that China would be absolutely screwed by this. Well, it turns out they prepared because they have huge stockpiles of it. But also, the demand for what they're really good at, which is renewable energy, batteries, solar, wind, has gone through the roof.
Yeah.
So interesting little indicators here. In America, where they're not particularly enamored of electric vehicles, the search for electric vehicles in March has gone up by 25% or something. The demand for buying these things made cheaply and very well by China in Europe has gone up 100%. And then you look at what Trump has been doing, drill, baby, drill. And not just that. His legislation in the big, beautiful bill has been anti-green energy. But it also happens that 93% of all the new electricity coming online generated, in this year will be done by renewable sources of energy. So American companies, individual states are going green as the president is going back to the dark ages. And everyone has got their eye on China because China has totally nailed this particular industry. And just one other one, 12% of the entire energy consumption in America in 2028 will be used by these massive data centers that AI needs to be AI. Where's that energy going to come from? And who's on the plane with Trump to Beijing? These guys are going to be talking to energy companies, about solar and wind and so on. And I just find it's a bit like Trump has absolutely doubled down on buying chisels and slabs of granite, just as the Gutenberg Bible is printed in a printing press. It's bonkers. And it doesn't make financial sense. And who's going to tell him that?
Only earlier this year, he told a group of voters in Detroit, if China comes and builds an EV factory here and gives you jobs and investment, I'd be supportive of that. To the kind of chagrin of a lot of people in his administration. What, we're allowing Chinese EVs into America and Chinese factories into America? So Trump is not consistent on this point either.
But this combination of industrial policy in China and a really hard knock school of capitalism, where, I think it was Tom Friedman from the New York Times who described it, that in China, the Chinese state government or the national government will give you a subsidy to start something new. And 5 of these factories will be competing against each other under the most brutal circumstances. And then one of them will prevail and they will get support from the state. The others all go to the wall. But it's like a gym. They're working out in the gym of capitalism. And I'm someone who's covered America in the 90s, but also lived there for 11 years after 2002. The thing that really got under the skin before was Japan. Japan really got under America's skin. But that was nothing compared to what China's doing, because China is essentially beating America at its own capitalist game with the intervention of the state. And that is something that Americans freak out over.
Yeah, well, they call it not playing by the rules, don't they?
That's one way of describing it. Yeah.
Can I circle back to your indicator, Cindy, which is about this contest that now seems to be there on sanctions and the so-called secondary sanctions. In other words, if you do business with our enemies, you can be sanctioned too. Am I not right in saying, though, because as far as I understand it, the oil that's coming from Iran that's still making it to China is being transshipped at sea onto other tankers. So there still seems to be a wariness on their part about breaking the sanctions on Iranian oil.
Yeah.
So how big a sea change is it then if they start to contest those American sanctions?
As I understand it, sanctions on Iran have impacted Chinese behavior when it comes to Iran. So actually in 2021, China signed a $400 billion investment deal with Iran, which Iran hoped would lift it out of its kind of pariah state status. But very little of that investment has transpired, actually, because when you're an average Chinese company, you're worried about being punished by the Americans for doing that business. So the sanctions work. The Chinese entities are restrained. At the same time, what has happened during this war is that America sanctioned Chinese refineries that are using Iranian oil in a way that it hasn't done before. So 5 leading refineries have been sanctioned, as well as one of the biggest refineries in China itself. So that's what triggered China to use this blocking rule to say, you can't get away with this. We are going to give some protection to our own refineries, as it were. And so we're basically just starting to see, the sanctions so far have worked. They have restrained China. But I think we're starting to see China kind of calling the bluff on that and making other people choose sides to say, are you really going to obey the American way of doing things when we don't recognize these sanctions?
To what extent is the Chinese media full of sort of snide remarks about America losing the plot? and we are now the designated adults, on the global stage, and people are coming to us. They may not like the embrace of Uncle Xi, but it's better than, Uncle Sam was, basically gone from being unpredictable to being unreliable.
Yeah, there's a joke about Chinese state media, which is the nightly news, the 6 o'clock news equivalent, if you will. It's always split into 3 sections. The first section is always where President Xi has gone, or some leading visitors.
Handshakes, the handshakes.
Yeah. Section 2 is all about how the rest of the world is burning and everything's in turmoil. Section 3 is basically criticizing some world leaders doing something else. So it is a very kind of joke format that people joke about. And you're right, you do expect that from state media. But I think a lot of people are fascinated by Trump, actually. Trump actually has a Chinese name that kind of people in China gave him called Chuan Jianguo. Chuan being the transliteration of Trump, and Jianguo means to build the nation. So to say that actually Trump is making China great again. He's building China back up again.
Wow.
Because of what he's doing can be interpreted in so many ways as actually being conversely good for China. So they find him quite a comical character. But on an official level, it's a lot of respect, as we've seen on this visit, but there is a lot of criticism as well. For example, in Iran, is a classic case of American imperialism rearing its head again, etc.
And how has the issue of possible Chinese military supplies to Iran in this war been sort of tiptoed around in this summit? Because Trump said that thing about the ship they boarded, the Tusker, that was going from Malaysia, implying that it was carrying Chinese weapons towards Iran.
He said it was a little gift from Beijing, perhaps. We don't know. Very
and
vague,
then there's also been leaks on that subject as well, intelligence-wise. So does that lead to a confrontation or is Trump too in awe of the moment?
So he was asked about this in an interview a while ago, and he said, well, actually, we probably do similar. Again, to the kind of disappointment of interviewers and hawks in the administration, that Trump would be just so blasé about China supplying technology to Iran. And I think on this question, it's important to look at what China does do, which is the dual-use technologies, things like cameras, or we heard about in the FT investigation, satellites, for example, technologies like that Iran doesn't get from other places. Not military per se, but dual use. So it's definitely very important for them.
And satellite imaging as well, right?
A big record of that with Ukraine, though, as well, isn't there?
But then there's also
all the components for drones.
Yes, exactly.
And all the other bits and pieces.
Well, famously, the Ukrainian and the Russian buyers had to be time planned in their visits to Chinese factories so that they don't run into each other buying the same drone parts. So I think Trump understands that cynicism, understands that pragmatism, and maybe almost respects it. And so it doesn't seem to be coming up. But it is interesting to see him say, maybe we will need, China to take a step back. Certainly Marco Rubio is saying that. But Trump probably doesn't want to be asking China for help because it feels like it's admitting a bit of weakness here. But I don't know behind closed doors how much he will.
And
really
on
lay
that sort of
that
compare and contrast the two readouts, the Americans had this point that China said it wasn't up for paying the Hormuz toll booth.
Yes.
I mean, logical enough that China will not want to agree to a system where they end up paying.
That was in their joint statement as much as it was
it as well?
Yeah, they did say we don't want the militarization of the Strait of Hormuz, or we don't want it to be turned into a revenue source. I think along those lines. So I think they both understand if they go down that road, the people closest to the toll booth are the Iranians. So they're making. It's going to cost them more than it's going to make them, even in Trump's terms. You've got an indicator, haven't you, Mark?
Is this going back to the Iran war?
Yes, I think so.
We are now effortlessly pivoting back towards the Gulf and the Middle East. Interesting, though, the way it's suffused this first part of this conversation. So this is another chapter in the leaking file. And the fact that, in addition to the leak we had about the Chinese and their relative power political positions, there have been leaks in the last 10 days about how much the US and Israel have or have not achieved against Iran militarily, and the degree to which the Iranians have used the last few weeks of ceasefire to put right some of those problems. So the Iranians, for example, have these underground missile cities. They can't really be destroyed, even with those big penetrating ordnance bombs that the Americans have. So instead of that, what they did was cave in the entrances. Well, of course, the Iranians have been working away feverishly during these recent weeks. And according to one of these reports from the CIA that got leaked, 30 of the 33 underground missile bases are now operative again.
30 of the 33?
Indeed. So we don't know how many of the missiles were left inside. I mean, basically what the Israelis and the Americans did was to bomb the entrances to sort of stop them up. Of course, they were also destroying missile launchers outside when they came out to launch. But the estimate again there is that 80%, around 80% of launchers may still be intact. Now, to me, there's something a bit fishy about this estimate. To me, I think what it also shows is that a very sort of political way this intelligence is being shaped by the analysts, but also, of course, by the journalists who want a good, solid Trump's war is futile type headline. Because if you look at all the short-range systems, some of which can hit, Kuwait, or I'm sure that's true. I'm sure that because there are so many of them. Essentially, if you think about it as a pyramid of capability, and up at the top, they've got sort of satellite launchers and proto-ICBMs, and it's tiny in number. And then a bit further down, it's the stuff that can hit Israel. And then, so I'm sure that many of those short-range launchers are still intact. But that question, and of course, it's particularly salient for the Gulf neighbors who are within range of those systems. So if the war starts again and the Iranians have substantially...
it's the Gulf that gets in the neck.
Freed up their capability and got those bases going again, then there's a big question. And I think the leaking of this, the timing of these leaks, which I guess all tend to sort of say, don't restart the war and you haven't achieved as much as you have, incredibly unhelpful for Trump, I think.
I mean, just quickly, do you think, given the fact that, once this state visit is over to Beijing, and everyone thought that there would be a natural extension of the ceasefire that already looked very wobbly, at the beginning of the week, do you think that we're back to where we were a few weeks ago? We're back to non-ceasefire? Has the pause been long enough for both sides to make more stuff, or do they just want to have the ceasefire continue? Because it suits both to have it going on.
Yes, and I think you said a few weeks ago, didn't you, that you predicted a sort of dribbling sort of end where nothing was definitively decided. And I think that's a distinct possibility. Look, the first thing we need to look for, indicator, is whether China makes some kind of diplomatic démarche after this summit meeting. Because it may well be that, it has all its own reasons and has really emphasized that it wants this conflict to be stopped. So they may make, and that could give the Iranians a bit of diplomatic cover to just budge a bit, particularly on that Strait of Hormuz toll booth line of theirs. So if we get past that over the next week or two, and that doesn't work, and that doesn't happen, the Chinese don't get involved in that way or use their Pakistani friends to help them with that, then I think, yes, it is a possibility that we go back to no peace, no war, which is terrible for the Gulf states, clearly.
Can I ask you, Cindy? I mean, on one level, it looks as if this could be win-win for China. So you put pressure on the Iranians, you open up the Strait of Hormuz. Maybe it's a toll booth, but with a very low toll, whatever. I mean, there's some resumption of traffic, and you can say this is a big deal. The Americans say this is a big deal now. What is China actually? What is it prepared to do, or rather, what does it need from America in order to exert that kind of pressure on the Iranians? Because that is America's weakest point here, isn't it? I mean, okay, the Boeing planes, 500 Supermax jets, that's great. And Trump loves that kind of stuff. And soybeans, that's a big deal. And he loves that too. But the thing that really matters to him is getting the Chinese involved to open the strait. So getting back to my Taiwan point, is that the price they'll demand? Is that why we had a silent Donald Trump this morning?
This is the $40 billion question, Matt. And that's obviously the size of the arms package that the US is selling to Taiwan. So, if they say we're going to sell Taiwan less arms, who knows what Xi would be willing to pay for that. But I would just caution that China doesn't tend to do mediation. It just historically doesn't tend to do that kind of world policeman figure, that global negotiator figure. The only basically exception to that was in 2021, I think it was, between Iran and Saudi Arabia when they had an accord. But I hear that actually other countries had basically made that happen and China just came and rubber stamped it. Beijing is very, very cautious about expending any resources on things that it considers not really its own concern. And of course, China wants the strait to be open, but it is far from the biggest loser in the current situation at the moment. So I think it's just kind of setting it out, basically. Let's see what the next 24 hours bring. Perhaps Trump can charm Xi more than I am giving him credit for. But I would be skeptical that China is actually going to do anything that helpful when it comes to Iran. I mean, I think if they did, maybe that would be a new chapter of China's soft power in the world. But I don't think they would see there would be that much in it for them to do that.
Mark, you've got another indicator.
Yeah, well, the only other thing which I think really screamed out at me during the coverage of the past couple of days is this report that Saudi Arabia was bombing away during the active phase of this conflict.
On the sly.
Yeah, and none of us kind of knew it. Now, I had said, sitting in this very studio a few weeks ago, that the United Arab Emirates had hit the Lavana Island oil terminal. I mean, there was pretty clear evidence that the UAE had dropped bombs. But the idea that the Saudis were doing it, and were doing it to apparently set red lines and ground rules with Iran about, if you hit our oil terminal in the Red Sea, you'll get a lot more bombs. That sort of communication going on through diplomatic channels is absolutely fascinating, because in a sense we now have to look back at the things that were happening during the latter part of the war, or the active phase of this, and think to ourselves, oh, well, was it perhaps the Saudis that were influencing the Iranians both not to destroy their infrastructure on the Red Sea coast, but also to come to the negotiating table?
But one thing, what smells fishy to me about that is, why didn't Donald Trump tell us this was going? They must have known, right? There's no way that would have evaded the CIA. They would have told Trump, and Trump was desperate to say, look, there are all these other guys who joined me in my battle with Israel, and they're not doing enough. Surely he would have said, look at the Saudis.
Or indeed the Israelis to leak it, as they did the Netanyahu trip to the UAE, which the UAE now denies. No, absolutely. Well, for whatever reason, everyone kept mum. Maybe, people are a bit afraid of Saudi Arabia in geopolitical terms.
And especially of, Mohammed bin Salman, for good reason,
Exactly. Now, I think we've got time for one more indicator.
This is a really...
You are going to pot it for us.
I'm going to pot it, and it's off Broadway for this, because this is about Chinese power. But it's not about the kind of power that we're seeing at the moment in Beijing between Xi and Trump. This is about China's soft power.
Come on,
and
you're on cue.
For goodness sake, stop dropping the hints. I'm talking about your favorite game, snooker. So how many snooker fans do you think there are in China?
God, millions, at least.
130 million super fans. Wow. And the number of, snooker halls in China has gone from 30,000 roughly in 2005 to 300,000. Most importantly, the last two world champions in snooker were Chinese. There's a guy who won just a few weeks ago. He's 22 years old. And the previous winner was a little bit older, but he won last year. And the last guy beat a guy called Sean Murphy, who was known as the magician. in England. He was an amazing guy from Essex, 43 years old, was thought to be the best snooker player ever. So along comes this Chinese kid, he's 22 years old. As he gets his trophy, a woman runs out from sort of right stage and hands him the flag of the People's Republic of China, and he holds it up to the cameras. And the same thing happened last year when the other Chinese guy won. So what's so interesting is that we respect China for its electric cars, its robotics, deep seek AI, all that stuff, the sheer exuberance of its economic growth. But soft power, not so much. What are the great Chinese superstars in the world? But the fact that the Chinese, obviously this is because the kid is talented, China's obsessed with snooker, but it's encouraged by the state. They've got a state snooker academy in Beijing, for goodness sake. We don't have that in London. The fact that they're using soft power to be more noticed and even perhaps loved on the international stage, I think is absolutely fascinating.
Matt, just to turn that on its head as well, it's also a success story for Western soft power, that snooker is so beloved in China, as is, football, for example.
Yes.
Harry Potter, Downton Abbey, all of these things. I could sound like the Prime Minister in Love Actually if I keep going with the list.
Thank you very much to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks. It's great to have you, Cindy. Thanks very much. That's the Indicators. See you next time.